Hello everyone, my name is Brandon, and welcome to our presentation. Today we will be talking about the fun and fascinating world of ethnography. We will introduce you to the history of ethnography, why we do ethnographies, ethical issues in ethnography, as well as the different types of ethnography. Personally, I write ethnographic case studies, but before I go on, you should get to know my ethnography colleagues.
So hi, I'm Claire and I do critical ethnographies.
Hi, I'm Claudia and I'm a realist ethnographer.
And now that we've all been introduced, it's time to get on with our presentation, and we look forward to sharing a little bit about what we do with you.
Ethnography is a qualitative research procedure, and it describes, analyzes, and interprets a culture sharing group. So culture is very important in ethnography, and it's defined as everything having to do with human behavior and belief. So what's really unique about ethnography is you're going into the field, observing, collecting data, documenting what's going on, and actually interacting with participants, which is something really interesting and unique to ethnography.
An important question to ask is why we would even conduct an ethnography. Well, because an ethnography provides a way to better understand a culture sharing group. So, when our research problem or interest involves studying a culture sharing group, which is a group of people that have spent enough time together that they've developed common language, shared behaviors, and beliefs, an ethnography provides a useful way of doing this, since, as we've learned, ethnographies focus on culture. If we're interested in the cultural themes within a motorcycle gang, for example, we might use an ethnography. Our culture sharing group might be narrowly framed, such as the exploitation of women within a motorcycle gang. Or it might be framed broadly by studying something like an entire motorcycle gang using themes surrounding the group's economics and their use of violence. An ethnography might also help us to understand a larger issue that is culturally significant. We conduct an ethnography to capture the rules of a culture sharing group. We do this when we have long-term access to a group, allowing us to develop a detailed record of their behaviors and beliefs, their rules, over time.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the history of ethnography. So ethnography comes from cultural anthropology, and it emphasizes writing about culture and how the reports would be understood and read within today's society. So in the late 19th century and early 20th century, anthropologists immersed themselves within different societies and different cultures to get a better idea of what that group was like, the language they spoke, how they differed from American society, just kind of learning those different ways and their different culture. They did refrain from becoming too close. They wanted to remain objective within the field. And then it was through the interviews and the observations that the standard procedures of data collection today have really come to life. So as a critical ethnographer, I also look at what was borrowed from the sociology field. And within this, it's really highlighting the lives of marginalized people within the society and taking perspectives from everywhere, such as feminist thought, racial views and expressions, orientation, and maintaining sensitivity around gender and race as well.
A cultural theme in ethnography is a general position, declared or implied, that is openly approved or promoted in a society or culture. Essentially, these are the ideas and patterns that make a society or group tick. An ethnographer does not enter the field hoping to randomly observe anything and everything that walks in front of them. Instead, we are interested in adding to our existing cultural knowledge. We do this by using cultural themes. The use of cultural themes does not narrow our focus, however. Instead, as we enter the field to study a group, we do so through the lens of whatever cultural theme we have identified, looking for how that theme manifests in the group we're studying. For example, We might use entrepreneurism as the cultural theme in the time we spend with our motorcycle gang. This lens will then inform the personal and economic relationships we observe both within and outside the gang as the group seeks to find novel ways to conduct and grow their businesses. Where do we find cultural themes? In addition to those in our own lives, we can find them in introductory textbooks and dictionaries of concepts in cultural anthropology. As well, we might find them in the titles or at the beginning of other ethnographies. A culture sharing group is two or more individuals who have shared behaviors, beliefs, and language. To develop these kinds of similarities among individuals, these groups typically exhibit certain characteristics, including the tendency to interact on a regular basis and for a significant amount of time. This time and frequency encourages the promotion of culture sharing among members. Also, the group is often representative of some larger group, since the patterns that might develop in one place might, with similar conditions, develop elsewhere as well. For example, the Hells Angels Club in Montreal is representative of Hells Angels clubs throughout North America and the world. Finally, the group has adopted shared patterns of behaving, thinking, or talking. This might be seen in certain jargon the group uses when speaking about themselves or others, or through rituals that determine their conduct.
Ethnographers are looking for a shared pattern of behaviors, beliefs, and languages that the culture sharing group all engage in over a period of time. So a shared pattern is understood as a common social interaction that acts as an expectation for the culture sharing group. So the culture sharing group will typically engage in one or a combination of behaviors, beliefs, and languages, and that's what makes them unique. In ethnography, the researchers are actually going out into the field and collecting data through spending time in the participants' sites where they're living, working, or playing. So to understand the patterns of the cultural group, the ethnographers are actually spending a good amount of time in the field observing and collecting data. There are three different types of data collection. Emic data is information that's supplied by the participants in the study. So this is often referred to as first order concepts. So an example is like a local language or an expression of emotions or just ways of expression. The second type of data collection is etic data. And this is information that's represented by the ethnographer's interpretation of the participant's perspective. So this type of data collection is typically referred to as second order concepts. The third type of data collection is negotiation data, and this consists of information that the participants and the researchers agree to use in a study. So in a ethnographic setting, the researchers use a variety of techniques to gather data in order to get a full understanding of a situation. So some examples of different data collection could be a casual conversation, key informant interviews, semi-structured interviews, questionnaires, maybe just observations, focus group interviews. So there are a variety of ways that ethnographers can collect data by observing and interacting with participants.
Okay, next we're going to be talking a little bit about the description, the thematic data analysis, and interpretation elements of an ethnography. So the purpose of all of this is to describe and analyze a culture sharing group so that you're making an interpretation about the patterns that you've observed and from what you've seen and heard, and then eventually drawing conclusions on the meaning behind what you've been learning and studying from the people in the site. So to kind of break that down a little bit more, we're going to look at description. So description is a detailed rendering of what is going on between individuals in scenes to see and depict what is happening in that culture sharing group. So this is specific. You really want the reader to have a mental picture of what was going on and what it's like to really be there. So your objective here is to transport the reader to that site with those people. Next is the thematic data analysis. So this is breaking down how things work through naming the essential features of what you learned within your ethnography study, through the interviews and the observations. So you're coming up with very small overlapping themes while having with having evidence for each theme as well to really show the meaning behind those themes. And then lastly, you're looking at the interpretation aspect. So this comes after the description and themes, and you're drawing inferences. So you're forming conclusions about what was learned, and this is really subjective. So it's from the perspective of the ethnographer. And the purpose of all of this is to return to the literature and the cultural themes and looking at those in regards to your study, and then raising further questions. So what are the gaps? What else needs to be looked at is the next step for that. So just kind of thinking of our example of motorcycle gangs and a description, what you're going to be looking for in that is that the ethnographer has described what it's like to be there with the members of the motorcycle gang and being on those sites. So you really want to have a good description so your reader can understand exactly what that feeling was when you were there. And then the thematic data analysis will be the themes of what you learned within the motorcycle gangs. So this could be something like membership. So what their values are with membership, how you go into it. Is it older people? Is it kind of passed down? So looking at all those aspects. And then you're looking at the interpretation with it. So as an ethnographer in that setting, what did you take out of this experience and what was meaningful for the participants and the sites that you were at? You're making a personal assessment on what's been learned, and then you're raising more questions based on that as well. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at the context and setting. So we're looking at the setting, the situation, or the environment that surrounds the cultural sharing group that you're studying. So this is really multi-layered, interrelated. It's consisting of factors such as history, religion, politics, economy, and environment. And also looking at the context, it can be a physical location, but it doesn't have to be. You're also looking at the historical context or the economic condition as well in relation to that. So going off of our example of motorcycle gangs, the setting may be at a bar, it could be a clubhouse, it could be a stretch of road that they really like to travel on. So you're looking at all those different locations, along with perhaps the economic condition is that they're all blue collar workers. So it's really dependent, and you're really looking deep into what the context and setting is for your culture sharing group as a part of a characteristic of what an ethnography is.
Reflexivity in ethnography refers to the researcher being aware of and openly discussing their role in the study in a way that honors and respects the site and its participants. Since ethnographic research typically requires a long stay at a site, we have to be keenly aware of the impact our work might have on the site itself and the people who live, work, and play there. Being reflexive requires us to negotiate with the appropriate people and authorities how we will enter the site, work there among the participants, and eventually leave the site, with the aim of leaving the site just as we found it. In our interactions with the site, and in our subsequent reporting, we must acknowledge that we ourselves have a history and cultural background that informs our own behaviors and thinking, and we must recognize that our interpretation is one among many and should not be viewed as being privileged in regards to the interpretations made by readers of our study, participants, or other researchers. To do this, ethnographers position ourselves within our reports, identifying where we're coming from and how this relates to our analysis. We talk about ourselves, share our experiences, and elaborate on how these things have shaped our views about the site and its culture. Finally, being reflexive means that the conclusions we draw are often tentative or inconclusive, which often leads to more new questions to answer.
A realist ethnography is an objective account of a situation. It is typically written in third-person point of view. The researcher is reporting from an objective perspective, so it will be free of personal bias, political goals, and judgment. A realist ethnography is just reporting the facts of a situation. This is from an objective perspective. The researcher is going to write the report without personal bias, political goals, or judgment. They are using standardized categories for cultural description. So an example would be family life, work life, social networks, and status symptoms. The ethnography is producing the participants' views through closely edited quotations, so the realist ethnographer has the final word on the interpretation and the presentation of the cultures. So it is very important that the ethnographer is doing this from an objective perspective without being influenced of their own personal biases and perspectives.
The term case study is often used in conjunction with ethnography. It is an in-depth exploration of a bounded system based on extensive data collection. Bounded means that the case is separated out for research in terms of time, place, or some physical boundaries. Some ethnographers use the term case to refer to the object we're studying, such as the London chapter of the Hells Angels. Others deem it to be a method of inquiry, since it requires that we very thoroughly and deeply uncover as much data as we can during our study. Probably it is a bit of both. Case studies differ from an ethnography in a few ways. For example, we might focus on a program, an event, or an activity that involves individuals within a group, where the group itself is not the focus. Instead, we might seek to study the initiation ritual of aspiring members as they strive to receive their full patch from a motorcycle gang. So, rather than describing the shared patterns of the group, we are more interested in the activities that are required within this bounded process. We are also less likely to identify a cultural theme at the beginning of our study. Instead, we focus on an in-depth exploration of the actual case we have identified. There are many factors to consider when designing an ethnographic case study. The case might be a single individual. It might be several individuals separately or in a group. It might be a program, events, or activities. For example, it might be one gang member. It could be several aspiring gang members, or it could be the implementation of a new business venture and how that is impacting the group. The case might be a process consisting of a series of steps. The initiation mentioned previously likely includes a number of different activities that ultimately form a sequence. So only by going through this distinct series of steps will an aspiring member undergoing initiation attain full membership. And by studying those series of steps, we complete the study of the process. In order to develop an in-depth understanding of the case, we need to collect multiple types of data, such as insurance records, mugshots, accounting information, business licenses, text messages, email, anything that might apply and that we can ethically acquire that will inform our study. This thoroughness means that we are typically limited in the number of cases we can study at one time. We also locate the case or cases within their larger context, such as geographical, social, political, or economic. Finally, and importantly, we study a case for 3 different reasons. The first, intrinsic, we select because the case itself has unique merit that warrants examination. The outlaws in Miami might be an example of this because they are interesting and we want to study them. The second type is an instrumental case, which we select because its study serves the purpose of illuminating a certain important issue. Lastly, they might also involve multiple cases, which is the third type, collective case studies. In these, multiple cases are described and compared to illuminate an important issue.
Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about critical ethnography. So kind of my wheelhouse about what I study. So critical ethnography is a type of ethnographic research in which myself, so the author's main goal is advocating for marginalized groups in society. So this, of course, adds an advocacy perspective to ethnography and the study of culture sharing groups as a response to changes in society, such as becoming multinational, globalization, that kind of thing, as we change our ways to become more inclusive with everyone and not just certain groups of people. So the focus here is on different factors that create systems of power, authority, prestige, and serving those who are marginalized, without a voice, or oppressed within our society. So through researching these groups of people and their shared cultural values, beliefs, and languages, we are able to involve them in creating steps for change as we include them in all the different types of steps that we are using when conducting our ethnography. So sometimes this even means they're part of the final report. You get to negotiate and collaborate with them. They really get to be a part of this research. So a large component in this is challenging the status quo. So through this, you're also giving people authority and empowerment. You're looking what can be changed and how to give people that voice to put them in the position of being able to make change. So you're involving concerns of power and control within that. And then in our example of motorcycle gangs, this could look like examining perhaps the stigma that people who are in those gangs kind of feel like they have. So how they're perceived by other people and maybe how that affects them within their daily lives, just based on their physical appearance. So within this culture and looking at ways to combat that, as we work together with them towards what they feel would be better, equality for them. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit about the different factors that are involved within a critical ethnography. So the first one is you're studying social issues of power, empowerment, inequality, inequity, victimization, oppression, and all those different kinds of themes. And you're really looking at how not only you empower someone, but empowering a whole culture within all the learning and the evidence that you've gathered within your study. So going off of that, what social issues does your culture sharing group face around inequality, and listening to those personal stories and experiences. Next, you're conducting stories that do not further marginalize the people in your study and the participants there. So you're really collaborating, anticipating, negotiating. You're using care in entering and leaving the site, giving back to the study participants. So here you're understanding their point of view and you're really having them involved with it. Kind of going next, is you're self-conscious about your interpretations. So you're realizing that these reflect their own histories and their own historical contexts, and that these can only be tentative. So you're concerned about how participants view your interpretations because you do want to make them as accurate as possible. And next is the position self to be reflective, and self-aware. So you're going to be really upfront about the intent of your study, what's the purpose of it, what's the written report going to look like. You're identifying your values and your biases within all of this. So you're no longer an objective observer, as in the realist approach, because you are trying to really see it from this culture's point of view. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about a non-neutral position. So this means that you will be an advocate for change to help transform society to become less oppressed and marginalized. So these people will have a say. You're coming up with steps, you have that call to action, and you're working with the participants in your study to make this a reality. So going off that, the last kind of thing to be thinking about as a factor is that this report will be messy, multi-level, multi-method, full of contradictions, tensions, and imponderables. So it comes from a variety of participants, sites, histories, experiences, and different experiences with oppression. So what you're learning about won't always fit into a neat little box, and that's really something to embrace within this type of ethnography.
To evaluate an ethnography, you would begin by applying the standards that are used in qualitative research. Then you would apply the specific factors that would be considered within ethnography. In a good ethnography, the researcher will do the following. The researcher would identify a culture sharing group or a case to study. They would focus on a cultural concept, recognizing that sometimes this can be broad. An example of a cultural concept is power. The researcher would provide evidence to show how the group has established some sort of pattern of behavior, language, and belief. The researcher would engage in field work and gather evidence through multiple sources, including observations and interviews. The researcher will show an analysis of this evidence through a detailed description of the culture sharing group and the context in which it exists. They will provide themes that summarize major ideas about how the group works and interpret and suggestions of how they illustrate culture at work. The researcher will lastly portray the research as reflecting in their own role in the study and how their background, their gender, their history, and how their bias will shape the account that they report.
Okay, so next we're going to be looking at the 5 steps to conducting an ethnography. So the first one we're going to focus on is identify intent and the type of design and relating that intent to your research problem. So within this step, you're identifying why you're undertaking the study and which forms of design you're going to be using. And then you're relating the intent to your research problem. So as a critical ethnographer, my goal is to seek to address inequity and inequality within society or schools, and my research is planned around advocating and calling for change within that specific social issue. So kind of giving an example within the motorcycle gangs, for step number 1 is the intent could be to study and get a better understanding of motorcycle gangs, and then the problem could be gaining that deeper understanding of women's role within motorcycle gangs.
So as a realist ethnographer, I would be looking at the problem relating to a culture sharing group and how that works. providing, looking at the problem, which requires a detailed description of the daily lives of people and how the problem relates to understanding a cultural theme. So for this stage, cultural theme is what's really important for a realist ethnographer.
And as a case study ethnographer, I will address the problem through focus on developing a deep understanding of a case. That might be an activity, an event, or a process. It might involve studying a person or multiple people within a certain setting. What is really important for me at this stage is identifying how I will use the case. So whether it is based on intrinsic merit, because the case itself is of interest, whether it is to better understand and provide insights into a certain issue, or by providing information based on a comparison of multiple cases.
And next we'll be going on to step 2. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at step number 2. So discuss approval and access considerations.
Now, in this step, all 3 design types follow a similar procedure. We need to receive approval from the Institutional Review Board. We need to identify the type of purposeful sampling that is available and that best answers our research questions. We need to locate a site where we'll study the research problem, identify a gatekeeper that will provide access to the site and the participants. And we need to guarantee provisions for respecting the site and actively design into the study how to reciprocate individuals at the site. So to disturb the site as little as possible, the ethical practices, both that align with our values as well as the participants, such as guaranteeing their privacy, informing them of what we're doing, and maintaining their anonymity if that's what they seek.
So an example of this, if we're relating it to the motorcycle gang example, would be when going into the field and getting them as our participants, we would be making sure that they're aware of the study, what it is, why we're there, getting their consent, and just making sure that they understand what the study is for, and just discussing and getting approval for the study.
And now we'll be moving on to step number 3. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at step number 3, which is use appropriate data collection procedures. So from looking at the view of it from a critical ethnographist, I'm less focused on time in the field or extent of the data, and I'm more focused on the active collaboration between myself as the researcher and the participants in the study. So since my intent of the study is to bring about change or call to social action, I'm asking the participants what should be involved, what's important in the study, and asking them again how they could be involved within the learning of the study and themselves and the steps to improve whatever inequity that they're facing. So with them participating with me in the study, this could be used in formulation of research questions, collection of data, analysis of data, and sometimes they even write the final report with you.
Since the intent of a case study ethnography is to do an in-depth dive into a specific case or issue, I seek to collect as many types of data as I can. This includes interviews, observations, documents such as might be report cards in the school, audio recordings, as well as any other information that I can access.
So as a realist ethnographer, I'm likely spending a considerable amount of time with individuals in the field. So it would be a minimum of 4 months. I would be entering the site slowly, trying my best not to disrupt it, building rapport with the gatekeepers and the participants. And this rapport building is essential for long-term contact. So there's emphasis on taking these field notes, observing the cultural scene. So some examples of a cultural theme could be artifacts, drawings, symbols, maybe some information that I get from interviews. That would all be considered the cultural theme. So for the example of the motorcycle gang, A realist ethnographer would make sure that anytime that data is collected, it is collected in an objective way, taking into consideration my bias as the realist ethnographer and making sure that that bias does not get transported onto the reporting.
And next we go to step number 4.
So the fourth step is analyzing and interpreting data within a design. So in this stage, you would be engaging in a general process of developing a description, analyzing the data for themes, and then providing an interpretation of meaning of that information. So as a realist ethnographer, I would be considering a balance among the description, analysis, and interpreting to each becoming their own importance in an overall analysis. I would discuss in my interpretation how I learned about the cultural theme while actively reflecting on the information that has existed in the literature and how the study has added to the understanding of the cultural theme.
And kind of next, looking at it from a critical ethnographer's point of view, I am looking at the description, the analysis, and the interpretation with the intent of shaping it to focus on the critical issue within my study. So I'm interpreting the findings in view of changes that need to occur, and I'm advocating for improvements in the lives of the participants that I've been studying. And oftentimes this means planning in advance the steps that I would take specifically towards change.
And as a case study ethnographer, my analysis, like the others, will involve description, analysis, and interpretation of the case. However, the procedures of doing this will be different depending on whether I am studying one case or comparing multiple cases. If I'm doing a single case, which with the example of motorcycle gangs, I would be studying one gang and their hangout. I would go through the method of the single case by analyzing that single gang and interpreting my findings. On the other hand, if I was to compare multiple cases, such as the Angels, the Banditos, and the Outlaws, I would analyze each case individually and then conduct a cross-case analysis to identify any common themes or differences among these different groups.
And next, we're moving on to the last step. Okay, so step number 5. Lastly, we're going to be looking at writing the report consistent with your research design. So as a critical ethnographer, I'm concluding the report with the critical issue that initiated the study in the first place. So within this, I'm discussing how the plan to have the participants benefit or change from the research will be included, along with a call for action by myself that could be a reflection of the changes the participants experienced or would like to experience in the future. So looking at our example of motorcycle gangs, I'm taking the information I learned throughout the study and I'm including the call for action about what's going to be done about the particular social issue that the participants in the motorcycle gang felt was important to them.
So as a realist ethnographer, the report would be written as an objective report of information about the culture sharing group. My personal biases will be kept in the background, and a discussion at the end of the study will indicate how the research contributed to the knowledge about the cultural theme. So for the example of the motorcycle gangs, as a realist ethnographer, I would keep my personal biases of motorcycle gangs to myself. So if my biases were that they were tough and strong and maybe sometimes they could do bad things, that bias would not be added into my report because the report needs to be objective without my personal biases.
And as a case study ethnographer, I'm allowed to write reports in many different ways. For example, I might choose to rely solely on a description of a case without paying any attention to the development of a theme. For example, I might just describe the motorcycle gang's clubhouse and the interactions within it in an objective sort of manner. without relying on the development of any social, economic, or other cultural themes. Other times I might strike a balance between providing a description of the case and the themes that I have identified. And something that uniquely distinguishes case studies from other qualitative designs is that I might try to generalize my findings to other cases. So when I'm studying multiple cases, I might identify findings that are consistent among those different cases that I've studied. For example, recidivism among motorcycle gang members. And I could generalize that to a wider cultural context to make informed predictions. However, it's important in this step in generalizing to be very modest with these claims, as I am still a scientist. So they should not be stated as fact, instead just a generalization.
Okay, and thank you so much for everyone for listening to our 5 kind of steps of conducting an ethnography, and we will be moving on.
Ethical issues in ethnography arise primarily in our fieldwork. Since it is in the field that we collect our data through interactions with participants, documents, and the site itself, a number of issues, ethical issues, can come up. Ethical challenges in fieldwork include the ways that we negotiate our entry into a site, the kinds of access we will have with participants, for how long and how often we will visit the site. For example, whether we agree that we will be there twice a week for 3 hours, or whether we will live there permanently for 4 months or 6 months. We also have to negotiate how we record at the site. For example, whether we can record natural talk, just the participants having conversations amongst themselves, or whether we can only record conversations we have during interviews. Importantly, we must also determine how we will interact with the participants themselves. If we were in a classroom, for example, neither the students nor the teacher would appreciate us seeking interviews in the middle of a lecture. So that would be something we would have to figure out beforehand, because it would definitely be unethical that our study would be negatively impacting the learning of the students. So what do we do about all of this? First, we should be open and transparent about gathering data. This requires that we inform all participants in the study what we're doing and why we're doing it, as well as the general impact it might have on their life and within their group, as well as the sources of support and funding for the project. The participants might obviously want to know if we're being funded by something they don't approve of, or if it might, there's some ulterior motive involved. We also need to treat and interact with participants and the places they live with respect, causing no harm to them while preserving their dignity and ensuring their privacy. To do this, we have to negotiate the extent to which we will be allowed to study their lives and the happenings of their group. We also have a responsibility to the academic community. We should not deceive readers by misrepresenting the participants of our study. And we should keep in mind that leaving a site as we found it will keep the door open for future ethnographers to study the same site. Because our work is so closely tied to the lives of those we study, it is important that we give back to the people and groups being studied. This should be appropriate according to the customs and context of the site being studied, as well as the requirements of its participants. So this might include some sort of financial remuneration, other material assistance based on what they need, or it could be advocacy. If it's a marginalized group, it could just be our, especially through critical ethnography, for example. Finally, when writing a report, we need to keep in mind how what we produce might impact those we have studied. Our report has the potential to cast them in a negative light. It could perpetuate stereotypes. For example, a study of homeless people, it might simply just expose their lives to people, just spreading the stereotypes they might not wish to kind of live under. Its publication might also expose a group to unwanted attention or renown. If you think about a group that's isolated somewhere tropical, and on come all the tourists. So these are all things we need to consider when conducting an ethnography.
Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of sampling techniques within ethnography. So because ethnography is considered qualitative research, we conduct data collection from firsthand observation, interviews, questionnaires, could be focus groups in there, recordings made in natural settings, and documents, different types of artifacts. So that could be something like a newspaper as well. And here we are looking at descriptive issues. So remaining interested in learning about values, we're exploring the issue. We don't have an answer about it yet. We don't really know about it yet. And those experiences aren't necessarily being quantified. We are there to explore. We are there to learn as we go. And when we're conducting interviews, we are looking at asking open-ended questions. We are looking at kind of dissecting different images and texts and pictures. And like I said, we are exploring because we don't know what's going to happen. And so when we look a little bit deeper at purposeful sampling, it's very widely used within qualitative research. And this means it has a variety of key informants who are knowledgeable about their culture sharing group and are able and willing to act as representatives in disclosing, sharing, teaching, and interpreting their own culture. So those are kind of the different types of ways that an ethnographer can sample different types of techniques within a culture sharing group. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today and watching our presentation.
We hope that you learned a lot and will be able to use this information for the future.
And we look forward to seeing you in the field someday soon.